Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Dan, as always, joined by Owen. Owen, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, how are you doing?
I got a haircut. That's the biggest news I've got. I had a haircut.
I did notice when we recorded the other day. I was like, Dan's looking streamlined.
I needed it pre doing Castles Relay, but yeah, it's finally happened. So I'll give it another 3 months and then I'll get it shaved off again. But
How
yeah,
how much faster do you reckon you would have been?
3 seconds a K, easy. More than super shoes, I reckon. Worth more than
Yeah,
super shoes.
yeah, especially on that gravel at the end. There's no
Yeah.
benefit from super
Yeah,
shoes.
well, I was going so slow, but I think aerodynamics weren't really a factor at those sort of velocities. But yeah. Uh, anyway, we've just got off a great interview with Professor Andy Jones, covering a really range of topics. But yeah, mentioning Faith Kipyegon's attempt at Breaking-4 for the mile, which will be really exciting to watch, happening in a couple of weeks. Talking about actually the differences between the different tests that you might use for a middle distance athlete versus a marathoner, like physiological tests that is. Talking about anaerobic capacity, durability. Anything else I forgot on there?
Talked a bit about. I mean, it's crazy to say, but working with Eluid Kipchoge, working with Paula Radcliffe,
Yeah.
if you don't know who Andy Jones is, look him up. I think we said on the podcast, on the recording, didn't we? Like, he is probably one of the biggest sort of exercise physiologists in the world.
Yeah. I barely feel like the need to introduce him, really, because most people are going to know. But famously a physiologist for Paula Radcliffe for her whole career, worked with Eluid Kipchoge in his Breaking-2 attempt. And then, Faith Kipyegon, lots of high-profile athletes that he supports and advises, but as well as that, is doing really cutting-edge research, again, in a diverse range of fields, VO2 kinetics, and priming, beetroot juice, supplementation, and just interested in anything like endurance performance, but primarily running performance. Like, he was a Newport Harrier back in the day, ran 65 minutes for a half, I think, 18 years old, something like that. So decent runner, and has become a world-class sports scientist. A really good interview with him.
Yeah. Before we get to the interview, as always, we're sponsored by SOAR. You still have time to sign up to the SOAR Summer Solstice. So we went through it last time, but there's different amounts of time that you exercise across the sort of start of June, and that gives you different discounts off of SOAR products at the end of it. So just chuck into Google SOAR Summer Solstice. It's a bit of a mouthful. Get yourself a discount on some SOAR gear for just exercising, for the next few weeks.
Up to £75 discount codes, which is goes quite far for a SOAR piece of kit. It's a great opportunity to dip your toe in if you haven't got any SOAR apparel yet. This is a nice way to go about it. So definitely go and check that out.
Yeah, 100%.
And I guess the last thing we want to mention is we do still have a few places left with the Endurance Collective. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, myself, Owen, and Jen have launched the Endurance Collective, which is an online coaching platform where oh God, I'm struggling here today. So best, instead of me explaining it all, go to our website, go look it up. We still have a few spots available for coaching. We use an evidence-based approach, like we do with our podcast, but also taking that experience that we have from being in the sport for collectively for about 3 decades, I think, maybe a bit more.
Long time.
Yeah. I feel I've been literally running my whole life. So all of that experience, will save you all the mistakes that I've made in my own training. And I guess the novel factor of what we're offering is, you'll have one lead coach, but there's you get the collective experience and knowledge of 3 coaches. So, for example, I may be a lead coach, but you want to try and do a hot bath intervention, try and boost your hemoglobin mass. Right, I'm going to refer you to Owen because that's his area of expertise. He can come and help prescribe that intervention for you and make sure that you're doing a really good job of it. And likewise, Jen brings a whole skill set herself. She's performed at the Commonwealth Games, been to major championships, 13, 14 times represented Great Britain, I'm pretty sure. Again, been in the sport her whole life and is really, really knowledgeable. So if you're interested, go and check out our website. There'll be a link in the show notes. A few spaces left. We're pretty much at capacity. We might be by the time this podcast launches, but at the minute still got a few spots available. So go check that out.
Cool. I think that's it from us. So enjoy the interview.
So we're very fortunate today to be joined by Professor Andy Jones. Andy's got a very diverse research portfolio, having looked at a diverse set of backgrounds such as VO2 kinetics, beetroot juice and priming, VO2 kinetics, and in addition to all of his research experience, is probably one of the most famous, or arguably the most famous applied physiologist there is out there, having worked with athletes like Paula Radcliffe throughout her whole career, Eluid Kipchoge, and in his Breaking-2 approach, and then now more recently working with Faith Kipyegon on her attempt to go sub-4 for the mile. So Andy, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
All right, thanks. Yeah, nice to join you.
Great. So we'd love to just dive straight into talking about Faith Kipyegon's attempt to trying to go sub-4 for the mile. Is she going to do it?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Probably quite literally. It's a tough ask. I think obviously if it was easy, it would have been done by now. And Nike don't go for easy wins. Really, this is a real challenge. The percentage improvement that's required is much larger than it was for Breaking-2. So, but that said, I think there is some hope, because if you look at Faith's performance, her 4:07 race, that was magnificent, at 5 seconds off the previous world record. So she's clearly the right person to be given it a shot at this time in her career. And if you look at the 4:07, there's room for improvement there, because she was only she only paced for just over half of the way, and she didn't actually take advantage of the possibility of drafting during a large fraction of that 57% of the time she was paced. So there's obviously some room for improvement there. I think the other thing with Faith, if you look at what she's been focusing on, it's been 1,500 meters and 5,000 meters. So she's been going into major championships needing to be able to run multiple rounds and to be able to win 5,000 meter golds. And so therefore, training specifically for 1,500 meters or the mile is not something she's necessarily done. So you could argue that if she were to train specifically for that she could be a little bit quicker. So when you put those two things into consideration, and then you think about all the bits and pieces that we outlined in a recent paper that we published in Journal of Applied Physiology called 7 Seconds Away, remember the old song? Then I think it could potentially be close. It's not going to be 3:55 or anything like that. It's going to be somewhere between 3:59 and 4:06, hopefully. And I think there's I don't know what it is, 10 to 15% chance it could be done. So it's worth watching. I'd be very disappointed if it wasn't a new world record, obviously.
Yeah, it'd be exciting to tune in for sure. 7 seconds, it's a big leap, isn't it? Yeah. 7 seconds. But yeah, like you said, lots of factors that could go into helping her run a bit faster. What's your involvement been with that project? I think you've had Faith in the lab. Is my understanding, is that right?
Not in my lab, no. So I've got a PhD student, Rebecca Osborne. She's the 3-time consecutive Northern Ireland 1,500 meter champion. And so she's a Nike-funded PhD student, and she's doing work on the physiological determinants of middle distance running performance. And I think when we decided that would be a focus for her work, there was always, I think, a plan in the back of some minds that this could be the next big project that Nike would go for. And so it was really just a case of aligning that. And, some of the work that Rebecca's done is looking at what are the determinants in the best athletes that we can get locally. But obviously the idea is, can we upscale that? To what extent does that model still work in super elites? So we're trying to sort of expand that database, and it was a really good opportunity to take Rebecca out to the Nike campus in Portland, Oregon, and Patrick Sang and the NN crew and Faith were there, showing off the gold medals actually on the most recent championships. But there was a chance, obviously, to do some testing while she was there as well, just to get some baseline numbers. That was back in September, October. So we just kind of assisted with that, really.
Yeah. No, it sounds like a really exciting PhD. Very, very exciting opportunity for Rebecca there. So talking about what is the difference between the physiological model for, say, a marathon runner and a middle distance athlete? Could you talk to us through that a little bit?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is in the original Joyner model back in 91 or whether it was in some subsequent version of it. But obviously the ones that everybody remembers is the VO2 max, the fractional utilization of the VO2 max, and then the running economy. So you get the sustainable VO2 for a given distance or duration. And then if you know the oxygen cost, then you can calculate the sustainable speed. And of course, I'm sure you're going to ask me about resilience or durability later as well. And those three numbers get close, but they tend to overestimate slightly in most cases what people can achieve. So we also need to add in another factor there, because those numbers aren't fixed, they deteriorate over time as well. But in one of those early models, there was another kind of box in the middle, which is like the non-oxidative anaerobic or energy contribution to any event. And there's an obligatory anaerobic contribution irrespective of the distance. It just becomes vanishingly small the longer you go. But obviously if it's a middle distance event, 1,500 meters, 2 to 4 minutes area, then that non-oxidative contribution is pretty large. And you mentioned VO2 kinetics at the beginning. The reason that it's a pretty large fraction of the total is because you can't meet the oxidative energy requirement instantaneously, because your kinetics of VO2 aren't fast enough. It takes a little while for them to get to where, or at least towards where they need to be. And so there's that whole anaerobic dimension, which we typically don't measure in marathoners because it's not a significant contribution to their success. But I think we calculated that, in the recent paper, that the anaerobic energy contribution to a mile in 4 minutes is probably about 15%. So it's still predominantly aerobic, but there's a large piece of the pie, if you like, that's anaerobic and that you need to get kind of some handle on. Otherwise, you're not going to be explaining or what that athlete is capable of, or actually helping them improve their performance either.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess one of the other difficulties is how you go about measuring anaerobic capacity, because the aerobic system is reasonably quantifiable, looking at oxygen consumption as a good proxy for the energy generated aerobically. How would you go about trying to measure anaerobic capacity in a middle distance athlete?
Yeah, and that therein lies the problem, doesn't it? And that's why it's not done kind of systematically, I think. As physiologists, we've never really landed on the best method, because there's always some sort of contamination, if you like. As soon as because the kinetics are pretty fast, and the fitter an athlete is, the faster those kinetics are. Even if you do a 10-second sprint, your VO2 has risen dramatically in that time. So the performance that you measure in a 10-second sprint is not entirely anaerobic. So you've got to look for some kind of proxy variables, and there are a few. None of them I think are perfect by any means, but that I think shouldn't prevent us from at least attempting to use the best thing we can find to get some kind of measure. So in no particular order, one would be the maximal accumulated oxygen deficit. So if you can estimate what the total energy requirement is, and you can measure the area under the curve for VO2, so you've got that aerobic contribution, then the difference between those two is the anaerobic. So arguably, someone with a larger anaerobic capacity would have a larger maximal accumulated oxygen deficit. I mean, there are some problems with that, because you have to, that prediction of what the energy cost is problematic, because these intensities are kind of supramaximal. So the oxygen cost that you measure during submaximal exercise, your running economy, is almost certainly not quite the same as it would be during supramaximal intensity exercise. But that's one potential way that you could do it, I guess. There's things like the anaerobic speed reserve, which have come up recently. So if you know what your maximal speed is, and you know either what your velocity at VO2 max is, or probably preferably your critical speed, then the difference between those, you could argue, is at least related in some fashion to anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity. There's that one. Peak blood lactate concentration. Obviously, you're not going to get the so-called alactic bit. It doesn't look at phosphocreatine hydrolysis at all, but arguably it's a marker of the maximal rate of anaerobic glycolysis, or at least of lactate accumulation. So if you were to do a bout of exercise, and 20 seconds seems to be about right, 150 meter sprint or 20 seconds, then you measure peak blood lactate concentration at the minute, as soon as they stop, and then for frequent intervals thereafter, and you find where the peak is. Arguably, that peak blood lactate concentration tells you something about the rate of anaerobic glycolysis ending in lactate. And then finally, the speed duration relationship. Obviously, you can model that and get critical speed, but you also get D prime. So that's the area above the asymptote, essentially. And that reflects anaerobic capacity to some degree as well. And actually, in Rebecca's work, she's looked at the interrelationships between, I think that was 4, wasn't it? Those 4 different possible metrics, and there's reasonable agreement between them. Interestingly, none of them in and of themselves correlates very well with performance, but then it would for middle distance performance, but it wouldn't, because it's still only a small fraction. But we are developing a model in which that does play a part. And what I was starting to tell you is that those 4 contenders to be a measure of anaerobic capability, if you like, do seem to have a reasonable agreement with one another.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I guess that is with the aerobic variables, there's a reasonably good consensus, isn't there, on how you go about measuring them. So like running economy, you look at oxygen consumption, a given submaximal work rate, and how you express that might vary, maybe mil per kilogram per kilometer, or just the absolute VO2, or you convert it to energy. VO2 max, like everyone's following a pretty similar protocol. You can argue that the threshold component, there's a bit more variability there. Are you going to look at lactate? Are you going to look at ventilatory thresholds or critical speed? But I think everyone's trying to estimate the same thing with the anaerobic side. That does get very messy. One of my most interesting, I think, pieces of practical work I've done as a physiologist was VO2 max testing some 100 meter, 200 meter, 400 meter sprinters, and going back to that maximal accumulated work idea. They did a VO2 max test, and they got to it. They plateaued, and they kept running.
Yeah.
And they kept running, and they kept running. For about 3 minutes, they had a VO2 plateau, and they weren't in visual distress when they finished. And then obviously their lactate was sky high at the end, but that's quite in complete contrast to someone like myself, who's a marathon runner, who I just about plateau at the end, and then I fall off a treadmill.
Yeah.
And I'm probably a complete opposite extreme. No anaerobic capacity, can barely break 60 seconds for 400 meters, but can run 2:12:59 for a marathon. So it's it's interesting.
Yeah, and I found the same thing back in my PhD work 35 years ago. So we did some testing with 400 meter runners as well, and you do like a 12-minute RAM test, and for the last 4 minutes their VO2 has plateaued. So this argument you sometimes see is that there is no plateau. Well, there is, if the person's got a sufficiently large anaerobic capacity so they can keep running when and you see that in the 400 meter runners for sure. Plus they have very high post-test blood lactate concentrations, 15 to 20 sort of thing. So I mean, it's an easy adjunct to do post maximal test in a lab anyway. I mean, you kind of get it anyway. Whatever the final stage was, you can get a peak lactate, and you could. I mean, the other interesting thing is that in the more aerobically trained you are, it seems that not only is the peak blood lactate concentration less, somebody like Paula who was ridiculously low, it was like barely 4 or 5 millimolar, but it also happens quite soon after they become exhausted. But with your more anaerobic athletes, not only is the peak very much higher, but it can take quite a few minutes into recovery before you see the peak as well. So it's really easy to sort of just add that onto a lab test. Arguably, you could go to the track as well and do, this VLA max type test or something as well, just to add to that, so that they're properly sprinting and you can get a single one-off anaerobic test essentially.
Yeah. I mean, both me and Owen have done field testing work with Welsh Athletics before, and with our people, our more junior athletes, we weren't getting in the lab. We'd do a field submaximal test where they'd do a series of 1,200 meter intervals on the indoor track in a controlled environment. Then we'd give them 10 minutes rest. Then we'd go, right, you're going to do 400 meters as hard as you can, and we'd measure lactate a couple of minutes afterwards.
Yeah.
And you're not getting a precise measure of this is what your VO2 max is, like you're getting, like this is like what your anaerobic capacity is, like you are with a VO2 max number, but certainly gives you a big flavor. And there you can very easily see who's never going to be a middle distance athlete and who actually could definitely be a marathon runner.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's actually potentially that peak blood lactate concentration. As you say, the protocol, you're probably going to get a slightly different peak depending on what protocol you use and when the frequency of your measurements and all of that stuff. But nevertheless, it's useful ammunition in helping you determine, what event is this person most likely to be suited to now or in the future, potentially. And if you track that over time, so actually with a middle distance runner, you might find that over the course of the winter, their performance on a regular incremental treadmill test gets better, their VO2 max gets higher, their thresholds go up, their economy improves, which is all very well. But actually, if their peak blood lactate keeps going down, they're arguably, they're more ready to run 10,000 meters or 5,000 meters than they are 8 or 15. So you don't necessarily want those to keep progressing, through the spring and into the summer. You don't want to suppress the peak blood lactate concentration either. So you might want to see that profile shift a bit as you get closer to the track season.
One of the ways that you can have influence on performance and potentially with Faith's Breaking-4 attempt soon is priming, which you've done a lot of work on in the past. We've done an episode on it, but I just again wondered if you could sort of talk through the idea of priming and then maybe how you would best go about implementing that. With especially a middle distance runner, but anyone sort of doing anything half marathon and below, how they would best implement it.
Yeah, so well, you say you've had an episode on it before, but obviously priming is part of a person's warm up, and the idea there is back in the day, what we used to do, and what a lot of athletes possibly still do, you do 10 or 15 minutes easy running, do a bit of stretching, and you do maybe 4 60-meter striders, and then toe the line, and the gun fires, and off you go, right? And you do that irrespective of what event you were racing over, whether it was a summer or it just is a cycle. That's what you do. That's your warm up. And so we were doing a lot of work in this field of VO2 kinetics, and there was an influential paper in, I think it was 1996, a guy called Anthony Giabino working with Sue Ward and Brian Whip, and they started to look at if you do 6 minutes of low intensity exercise and then 6 minutes of high intensity exercise with a 6 minute gap, what does that do to the shape of the kinetics in that heavy intensity bout compared to if you do it with no warm up? And then what happens if you change the intensity of the warm up? And it turns out that if you look at it, what happens to VO2 kinetics when you do 6 minutes of really hard exercise with no warm up, you get relatively slow initial kinetics, and then you get what we call a slow component. So you get this kind of delayed inefficiency that develops. And if you do a moderate intensity warm up before you do that, you get exactly the same kinetics. It makes no difference. So if you just do some jogging and some stretching and a couple of strides, probably that's not going to impact on your kinetics at all. But if you do a bout of pretty high intensity exercise and then you have a recovery and you do a similar bout again, the kinetics in that second bout are much faster. So the overall response looks more like a curve, right? So that the initial amplitude is higher and that slow component is trimmed out. And so they demonstrated that there were changes in the kinetics. And I think we were the first to go, well, actually, that has a potential impact on performance. So we started to do a series of studies looking at how you influence what people do in warm-up and what impact that has on their kinetics, and how the changes in their kinetics in turn impact on performance, whether that's time to exhaustion at a fixed intensity or whether it's the time it takes you to complete a given distance. And sure enough, it turns out that if you introduce something that's a bit higher in intent, not crazy hard and not too close to the start of the race, but we call it a primer because it basically gets your body used to running at the speed it's about to be asked to run at. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So when you go from a standing start to running at 60 seconds a lap, that's a huge increase in the energetic demand, the turnover in the mitochondria. So those mitochondria are going to need to receive a lot of extra oxygen, and they're going to need to be able to process all that oxygen. So you need to give them a bit of a rehearsal, essentially. And what happens is if you do something that's pretty high intense, of high intensity during your warm up, you produce some metabolites which cause vasodilation. So your muscles are already primed in terms of the capillary, in the vascular sense. So they're all your blood vessels are opened up. You've got big channels all of a sudden. You don't need to try and widen them. Your heart rate's a bit higher. Your cardiac output's a bit higher. So when the gun fires, your ability to deliver oxygen to your muscles is already halfway there. So that's cool. But obviously, the limiting factor is the enzymatic processes within the mitochondria, and so there's what we call inertia in the oxidative machinery is the term that's often used, because we think you can actually deliver enough oxygen anyway, but it's your ability to use it that's often the limiting factor. But if you warm up those enzymes by getting them, working at the rate they need to run at, by getting, you might do a 200 meter close to maximal effort, or you might do 3 or 4 minutes of fairly hard exercise. There's all sorts of different permutations of that priming. So it almost doesn't matter exactly what you do, but it's like interval training. There's lots of different iterations of this. There's the intensity of the priming back, there's the duration of the priming back, and then there's the duration of the intervening recovery period before the thing starts. And you need to play about with that to find what works best for you. And things like cool rooms, etc., can get in the way of that too. But anyway, if you do this properly, not only are you start the race, you can deliver more oxygen more rapidly to your muscles, but the enzymes within your muscles, within your mitochondria, are ready to process that oxygen as well. Plus, we found that motor unit recruitment is better. So you activate your fibers, more of the fibers, more rapidly, so more of the load is shared, and basically you end up going faster. And anyone who's run an interval training session will see the logic in this, because if you rock up at a track, do your regular warm-up and do, let's say, 10 400 meters, theoretically, the first one should be the easiest because you're fresh, and then the second one should be a little bit harder because you've already done something that's slightly fatiguing. But we all know that the second one and the third one feel a lot easier than the first one because you've kind of got your second wind and you're into the rhythm. Obviously, by the time you get to 8, 9, 10, they're getting hard again. But the point is that our experience of running interval training sessions is something that should inform how we warm up for races. Usually we're just kind of too scared. We want to save all our energy for the race. But honestly, expending a little bit more than you would normally does seem to pay dividends when the race starts.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I explain it to people. Like, when do you feel best in an interval session? Like, it's never the first rep. That one feels probably one of the worst out of all of them. But yeah, I think the barrier definitely comes to the confidence to going hard in the warm up, and will that take something out of me and leave me less fresh from a race? But from people who've tried it, listening to our podcast, they've all said, yeah, actually, we really feel the benefit here. And regardless of times, the first mile of a 5K feels so much better than if you've just gone on, done your 4 times 60 meters and started. I'd never go back to doing that.
That's been my experience as well. When people try it, the penny drops really with it. So we did a study with some pretty high class 800 meter runners. It was like an 800 meter time trial, and we compared them just doing their standard warm up, and then with a warm up in which we intervened and got them to do 200 meters close to, I think, pretty much at 800 meter race pace, 20 minutes before the time trial. And they were like, I think almost everybody was faster, but the total oxygen consumed was higher, and their speed was better maintained in the second half of the race. And I think on average, they were about 1.2 seconds faster, which I think they were like 2 minute 800 meter runners. So that's a really worthwhile improvement at that level. And obviously, because the kinetics is such a big component of an 800 meters and 1500 meters race, and I agree, 3K and 5K as well, then it's really meaningful for those events for sure. It becomes less so when you get out to 10K and all that, because then you're talking, it's just the first minute or two of 30 minutes or 60 minutes or 2 hours plus, and then it starts to become a diminishing fraction. And you've got to be careful with longer events that you don't, if you do something that's too intense and you warm up and you burn up too much glycogen, that's not a good thing if you're a marathon runner, obviously.
Yeah. And I guess going back to what we were talking about before about anaerobic capacity and glycolysis, I think people get a bit confused about where that battery of energy is being used, and if it's a lot of it is getting used at the start where your aerobic system is still gearing up. So I guess that's the whole reason why we want to get VO2 up as quickly as possible, is to spare that anaerobic battery for later on in the race. And like you said, with those 800-meter runners, they finished stronger, didn't they? So that's seems to be influencing or sparing their anaerobic capacity for the back end.
I mean, essentially, you've got a fixed anaerobic capacity. That you've got this kind of battery, this tank of anaerobic energy, basically. And so therefore, I mean, you want to expend all of that in any given race. But if you want to get faster, I mean, obviously, if you can improve your aerobic capacity and your anaerobic capacity in training, that's cool. But let's say this is like an acute intervention. You can't change your anaerobic capacity on the day. It's fixed. So the only way you can get faster is by delivering more, expending more aerobic energy, essentially, during the event. And the only way you can really do that is by doing priming. And you've still got the same tank, but it just lasts. So let's say the speed is the same. For the first 2 or 3 minutes of a 4-minute race, if you can get your VO2 higher more rapidly, so you hit your VO2 max sooner, then the size of the oxygen deficit is less, and the reliance on the substrate level phosphorylation, on the glycolysis, on the glycogen, the production, that is all spared. So you've got more of it left in that last minute, and hopefully you can go a bit faster. So you haven't got more energy, but you've used more aerobic energy. So overall, you're going to go faster, and you've spared your anaerobic energy for the sprint. Yeah.
So one last question on the priming. A lot of the studies have had like a 20-minute gap between the priming episode and the start of the time trial or whatever performance challenge they're using. Is that because do you think that's optimal, or is that just a factor of they're trying to design for this cool room period where normally athletes or professional athletes can't do a priming episode 10 minutes before or 5 minutes before because they're going to be in a cool room? They might be able to do 60-meter stride before they start their race once we've been called out onto the track. But they couldn't do a priming episode 10 minutes before because they'll be sat on a chair, exactly, having their numbers checked, etc.
Yeah, so I think that 800-meter study that I mentioned to you was deliberately designed with a cool room in mind, so knowing that they wouldn't be able to do anything in that window. So that's why it worked out. But if you're doing an open meeting or something, just trying to run a PB, and the cool room's not an option, not an issue, then there's all sorts of other ways that you could do it. The crucial thing is that you don't leave it so long that the effect on your kinetics wanes. And it does wane with time. So there was a study with Mark Burnley. It's certainly present after 10 minutes, after 20 minutes. It's a bit less after 30. It's much less again after 45. It's almost gone after 40, and it's definitely gone after an hour. So there's no point doing this too far out. But equally, you don't want to do it too soon, because if you start the race where your VO2 is still too high and your phosphocreatine levels are low, then your anaerobic capacity, if you like, is taking a hit there. So this is another reason where lactate can be valuable. Actually, we were finding that around going into a race with a lactate concentration of about 3 to 3.5 was about right. So you don't want it to be 1 on the start line, because you're going to be cold. It's not temperature wise, but that's going to be a shock to the system. But neither do you want it to be 5 or 6. Because it's not the lactate per se, of course, but you're going to have other intramuscular homeostatic perturbation that's not going to do you any good. And your phosphocreatine levels will be too low. So you just got to get the timing right, where VO2 kinetics will still be primed, but you're not fatigued and you're not too physically stressed on the start line either. So and maybe lactate is a good kind of way by which you can determine whether you're in the right ballpark or not. It's obviously something you're not going to try for the first time in a race. You're going to have to practice this in training. And there's more than one way to skin a cat on it. Like I was saying, you can do 200 meters pretty hard 20 minutes before if you want, but there's all sorts of other possibilities.
I guess so. We've touched a lot on the determinants of determinants of physiology and then how they relate to middle distance and sort of short distance events. At the other end of the spectrum, and another really big area is durability. We end up talking about this quite a lot. Like, we probably lean towards longer distance events like marathons. Just that's what we both do. But yeah, we've talked about the determinants of durability and training it, and we just wondered if sort of you had any thoughts on even how you could even identify going about training it, because I guess at the moment we don't even have an agreed upon measure, do we? It's a bit nebulous maybe, but yeah, we just wondered your thoughts on the whole topic and training it.
Yeah, well, I think this whole concept emerged out of the Breaking-2 project, because we were obviously using the joiner model as one of the ways by which we were selecting the athletes. But we had another Nike-funded PhD student, doing some data collection alongside that, doing some background science, Ida Clark, and she was doing critical power and W prime measurements before and after, well, in a fresh condition, then after 2 hours of heavy intensity cycle exercise. And what was interesting there was, I guess, not so much. Well, I think there is this sort of presumption in the joiner model that things are kind of fixed. If you know what the start line values are, you're going to be able to predict performance very accurately. And in some cases you can. And it's, I'm not knocking the model, it actually describes a lot of the physiology really well. But when we picked those 3 runners for Breaking-2, it was obviously actually on the basis of the joiner model. There wasn't much to choose between them. You could have like pulled a straw out of a hat and bet on DeCisa or Tadesse or Kipchoge. But obviously only the one man did the business at the end of the day and just dominated the marathon for the next 10 years. And he seems to have something extra, and you can call it durability or resilience. I've tended to call it instead, but yeah, he's got it in spades. Now, what is it that gives him more durability than Tadesse is an open question, I think. And how you go about measure it is another real big issue for us, I think, as physiologists, whether it's best done in the field. In the lab, it's problematic, isn't it? Because you could do some fresh measurements on the treadmill, and then you could send someone off for a couple of hours run and then measure it again. What I did start to do was, when you go through the stages and you go to maximum, immediately drop them back to 16 and measure economy again. So you can measure economy on the way up when they're fresh, and then economy when they're fatigued. And the difference between those is a real easy way to get some index of changed running economy in a fatigued state, albeit that it's a slightly different type of fatigue than you would get if you didn't run in a half or full marathon. So yeah, I mean, there's lots to talk about in that area. I think what are the mechanisms? What's the mechanistic basis for it? How do you measure it, and how do you train it? And I don't think we know how you train it. And the other question is, are there other things that you can do to improve it? And of course, I think the super shoe actually makes everybody more resilient, more durable. The high carbohydrate ingestion makes a difference to that as well. That's one of the things that Ida showed in her study. So I remember what I was going to say now. So what Ida found with her studies was that critical power on average was about 10% lower after 2 hours of cycling. But what was really fascinating about that was the variability between people. So while the average drop was 10%, there were a couple of people in whom the drop was less than 1%. Just unbelievable. You could do 2 hours of pretty hard cycling, measure critical power, and it's basically the same as it was in a completely fresh condition. So it's like bizarre. And then you had others whose critical power dropped 33-35%. So it was that inter-individual variability which made us think, actually, there's another component, another dimension to all of this that these models aren't currently taking account of. So I'm glad it's kind of taken hold, and people are at least thinking about it. I don't have the answers. I don't think anybody does yet, but collectively we can work towards trying to find some.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, there seems to be a growing amount of research papers coming out looking at durability. Like, we've done some stuff in our lab unpublished as of yet, but it's a really, really interesting topic. I think one of the big issues with the research is how do you go about defining it. I think that's one of the, and having a formal test for it. I don't think it's something that's ever going to be agreed on, but we all agree it's a thing. And we all know athletes who run a great half marathon and never convert to a marathon.
Yeah.
And I think you can label someone durable, but what is it that makes them durable? Is it training or is it genetic? I mean, I think intuitively it makes sense that someone who's more slow twitch is probably going to be, toe switch dominant, higher proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers is going to be more fatigue resistant. Like my PhD supervisor, Mike Hughes, his PhD was on repeated sprint ability in football players. So we'll do 5 times 40 meters as hard as they can off 15 seconds of turnaround. And it was, this is durability on a much smaller level, but the ones who were the fastest in the first 40 were the slowest by the 5th, but the ones who were slowest on the first one dropped off much less than the ones who were running the fastest for the first interval. So
the fatigue ratio type of a thing, isn't it? I mean, even in the single 30-second Wingate test, you see the same sort of thing. The people who can produce the highest peak power are those who end up with the lowest end power, and vice versa typically as well. So there's insight, I think, that can be got from those sorts of power profiles. But as you say, people have been talking about durability and resilience. I mean, you're automatically drawn to the longer events, I think, because you just think of it. But actually, start line values and finish line values in a mile are going to be very different as well. So there's this thing, I think, runs right across all intensities and durations, and whether it's intermittent or continuous. So I think there's a thing in football about this as well. So, football or rugby, most of the matches are won in the last 5-10 minutes, aren't they? And often it's the side that's least fatigued. They might be exactly as fresh as one another in the first half, but it seems to be that those that can think clearest and are physically, and that's usually because they're less physically fatigued, are the ones that can score late on. And there's probably a resilience component, a fatigue resistance element to the players and the teams that are able to achieve that best too.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting area. Makes me think though that it's something I've always thought, but the middle distance athletes, it's so much harder to get a middle distance athlete to be in peak fitness because they need to be good at everything, don't they? Whereas a marathon runner is reasonably straightforward in that you need to be more durable and you need all these good aerobic qualities. You just need to have better endurance. Whereas a middle distance athlete, you need to balance fantastic endurance, but also be able to run really fast for 400 meters, 200 meters, even like having a good 100-meter time. How do you balance all of that?
That's what makes this Breaking-4 project so fascinating, really, because it kind of forces you to think about that and work out what are the best ways to measure it, because it's been massively neglected. So I think that the fact that it's a middle distance project with a female kind of is important for those two reasons. The females have been neglected. We don't know as much about their physiology as we do for male physiology. So it's nice that the focus is on Faith when previously it was on Eluid, but it's also nice that it's a middle distance rather than a long distance. And just balance, there's an art and a science, isn't there, to actually making sure that somebody is in the best possible condition, both aerobically and anaerobically. So all that's good. And, and I do think that we've just kind of neglected the middle distance runners. You get an 800 or 1500 meter runner in the lab and you just put them through the same protocol as you would a marathon runner and hope they didn't notice that there's a big gap that you weren't able to plug, and that's not good enough, really. I've always felt a bit embarrassed about that, so it's good that we're giving it the attention it deserves, I think.
I think you said it's a bit of an art there, and we wanted to just ask about your role as an applied sport physiologist. You've got a huge range of research that you've published, but as we mentioned, you've worked with like some absolute greats of the sport, we just we wanted to maybe explore how do you meet Eluid Kipchoge and offer or be able to improve his performance effectively. And that's you're having that discussion with Eluid Kipchoge, Dan's having that with Welsh athletics athletes, like it's happening at different levels, but it's a big skill of a sports scientist to get buy-in. And yeah, we just wanted to, how do you see your role, and working alongside athletes and coaches?
That's a really good question. Before I come to it, I had one other thing to say to Dan on the last point, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
which
no
is
worries. Yeah,
that balance. It is harder for the middle distance runners because they've got to get everything right. But however, they do get more opportunities. If you're a marathon runner, you get maximum of 3 chances a year, don't you? And at least if you're a middle distance runner, if you don't manage it the 1 week, at least you can go again the next week or in a few weeks' time. So you can remedy those issues as you go along. So I just wanted to make that quick point. I think it's just kind of longevity in being in the game a while and having some success early on, and then you get a bit of a reputation. And I think you just got to continue to be enthusiastic and passionate about it, and just motivated to help people improve. I think it's good to have the underpinning science. The crucial thing is to be able to communicate it and get that trust thing. But as soon as you start to have some success, you get that credibility, you get that reputation, and people want to kind of work with you. You've got to be careful then that the things that you say are accurate, because people will tend to believe you more when it comes from someone who's got a reputation and some experience. I think when Nike were thinking of doing the Breaking-2 project, they've got brilliant physiologists, but although they're mainly biomechanists and thermo-reg people and clothing specialists and that, but they've obviously got great physiologists as well. But they weren't necessarily well versed in working with distance runners or marathon runners. And obviously, when it was this Breaking-2 project, it's like, well, how do we know which ones to pick? And I think they'd seen my papers, they'd heard me present at conferences, they knew about the successful work with Paula and other British athletes over long periods of time. So I suppose I was the automatic person for them to reach out to go, we could do with a bit more in-house expertise on this project. Would you like to help? And of course, it's a dream come true, isn't it? Someone like me who's a former runner anyway, but then has always researched endurance physiology and likes to make the application. I wouldn't really enjoy just being stuck in because I was at the Welsh Institute of Sport, of course, back in the mid-90s as well. And just doing the work with the athletes wasn't quite enough intellectual stimulation for me. I wanted to be the guy producing original research as well and making a difference to actual fundamental understanding. But I never wanted to completely leave behind the excitement of working with top athletes and helping them improve, because I'm a failed runner. You live vicariously through the people you help to some extent. So actually ticking both boxes and having that parallel track has always, I knew that from the get-go, that was always going to be really important to me. But yeah, it's the way that you explain it. And I think if you've been a runner yourself, you've had some success and you've tried the training that you're recommending, that kind of helps. And if you speak the same language as I would be much less successful if I was working with a cyclist or a swimmer or a rower, because they've got different vocabulary and they'd immediately see me as a fraud. But if I think I can get away with talking to runners about running and training and nutrition and physiology and that sort of thing. So that's the way it works. And I think so with somebody like Eluid, if Nike, who he's obviously worked with for a long time, say we've got this project and we brought in the world's best experts and they're going to help us do measurements on you, and then you do those measurements, and then if you sit them down and go, I think you can do this, and this is the reason why I think you can do this, they're gonna, they can buy into that. So because you've got that trust, you've got that reputation, and the way you communicate with them, hopefully, kind of, a lot of it's a bit of psychology, dare I say. You've got to kind of win people over, and that can take a while. You've got to kind of stick at it, and sometimes it's just being around a while and having casual conversations. Being someone that they can lean on and trust through thick and thin, that sort of stuff is important. And just to know that you're in their corner and you've got their best interests at heart, I think that's important. I think people can tell that intuitively. So it's all of that stuff. You've got to have the technical know-how, but a lot of it is interpersonal.
No, thanks for that. If we can dive a bit deeper into the nuts and bolts of actually how can a physiologist add value to the likes of Eluid Kipchoge or any athlete? Like, what do you think the role of a physiologist is there, and how can it where does the role of a physiologist end and the coach begin? You know, you talk about prescribing training based upon physiological testing. That's a balance, I guess, as well. Like we've talked about the art and science of it. What do you think a physiologist can bring to the table effectively?
Yeah, you gotta watch you don't kind of overstep the mark there, because you're not the coach. I don't. I mean, if you want to be a coach, fine. Go and be a coach or a coach stroke physiologist. I've never seen myself as a coach at all. But that said, if I was just a technician who made measurements, albeit accurate measurements, that would be a waste of my knowledge, I think. And my talent is, I think, if I've got one, is to make those measurements and go, okay, so I know what you need to do to achieve what you're aiming at, and this is where you're at presently. And if I look at the training you're doing, I can see some deficiencies here. I see that you're doing this really well. I can see that you could make some progress on this bit. There's a bit of a lagging indicator for you at the moment. If you did a bit more of that and a bit less of this, but the way that you couch that with the coach and the athlete is really important, because again, you've got to have the trust and the buy-in of the coach. But if they understand that you're not trying to do their job for them, you're just trying to help them, and they can take or leave your advice. I don't care, but I do feel it's my obligation to say what I see. Otherwise they wouldn't come to me, I suppose. But it's like this is your profile, and I think this is where you're going to be best. And I think this. If I were you, this is the sort of thing I'd focus on to make you your best in that period of time. And that's really it, I think.
Yeah, thanks. And just to continue on from that, how much confidence do you think you can have in, for example, this type of training is going to improve this characteristic? So moderate intensity training or zone 2 training, is that going to improve your fat oxidation rates, for example? Or if we're talking about threshold training, I think people always go, threshold training, that would improve your threshold. But where do you stand on how clear cut the relationship is between the exercise prescription and the expected training adaptation?
Yeah, well, I think you could logically. I think you can still have a hunch that certain types of training should potentially enhance certain variables, certain parameters. So if you know what the acute response is within these various domains, you could argue that the accrual of lots of acute impulses of that type of training should theoretically result in a specific type of chronic adaptation. However, so that's my that's where I would start. But there's all sorts of overlap, and there's all sorts of roads can lead to Rome. So mix another metaphor, I think. But there's lots of different ways you can get to the same goal. I mean, I'm always drawn to the comparison between Seb Coe and Steve Ovett, who both ran essentially the same time over 1,500 metres and trained in pretty different ways. And the same is true in the marathon. I think when Steve Jones ran his fastest times, he was running reasonably low mileage for a marathon runner, but pretty high intensity stuff. But you can do double that, albeit at a slower speed, and end up running similar sorts of times. So you've got to take in individual preference and all sorts of other factors as well. And we know that, if you do high intensity interval training, some of the adaptations you get to fuel utilization, substrate utilization, to mitochondrial volume and so on, is just as potent, if not more so, than if you do hundreds of miles of really low intensity work. But again, there's a bit of an art there, and it's getting that balance across the piece. I do think you've got to have it makes sense to tick as many boxes as you can and have a kind of continuum. You're going to do some relatively slow, relatively easy. But I mean, one of my philosophies is I don't think you ever want to be too far away from the speed at which you intend to race, whether you're a marathon runner or whether you're a 4-minute miler. Ultimately, you've got to train your physiology, your biomechanics, and even your psychology to endure a certain stress. And I do believe in the principle of specificity. And so I don't think you'll necessarily. I mean, if you never ran a mile at 2:12 marathon pace, you could still probably just about, if you were running some of it at 2-hour pace and a lot of it at 2:30 pace, it might still mean that you could run somewhere half decent in the middle. But I think you'd be missing a trick if you didn't do at least a few of your miles per week at 2:12 or 2:11 marathon pace. And it's the same with Faith trying to run a 4-minute mile. I don't think doing a ton of mileage at 5 or 6 minute mile pace and then doing a few flat out sprints once or twice a week is going to be as good as occasionally trying to run 8 400s in 60 seconds with 45 seconds. You've got to have some kind of practice at goal pace, essentially, I think.
And I guess it's also looking at what they're currently ticking in their training and seeing where they might be leaving things unturned, I guess. So like if you've already been doing loads of really high intensity stuff, then actually adding some more controlled threshold-based training might be appropriate. It might be a nice novel stimulus that's going to add something, right? Or vice versa.
I was at a Team Denmark event back in October of last year, I think, and it was quite interesting. There was a professional cyclist though who throughout his career, I can't remember his name, but he changed coaches multiple times, and each of those coaches had a different philosophy. And every time he changed coaches, he would change his training in line with this coach's new philosophy, and he'd get a bit better until he didn't anymore, and then he'd change. And it's almost like a change is as good as a rest. And it's almost like a football team who get, they're terrible and they get a new manager and then they win 2 or 3 games. And so it's almost like it doesn't matter what but not doing exactly the same thing week after week, month after month, year after year, having a bit of a change now and again. So just kind of, I think if you're a bodybuilder, they have this thing called like shocking the muscle. If you just did 8 sets of 10 bench press twice a week forever, you probably wouldn't progress very much. But sometimes you've got to lift heavier and fewer reps. Sometimes so you just got to mix stuff up, and you've got to do different, rather than just do flat bench press. You might do incline dumbbell bench or press or whatever, that sort of thing. So just mixing things up, I think, is really valuable. I mean, I did just say that doing the same thing routinely, week after week, month after month, year after year, is probably not the best approach. However, if you do that, Paula did that kind of thing, Eluid does that kind of thing, they end up being bloody resilient. And so I think that kind of long-term, being able to train consistently, really regularly, almost every day for year upon year upon year is probably one of the keys to this resilience concept. But yeah, so there's no shortcuts to that one.
I think one of your bits of work that me and Dan at least talk about the most is the paper you published, sort of detailing Paula's training over a number of years, and I think maybe one of the I guess conclusions that people have then drawn from that is this idea that VO2 max doesn't change across a career, or has very limited scope for change once you're well trained, and the other determinants of physiology change. Do you think that's maybe being misinterpreted, or are we, generally correct? Obviously, it's an N of 1, but that's probably the main conclusion like we draw from it. But I guess as you did the work and wrote it, I wonder if you have the same sort of thoughts as well.
I mean, what that simply shows is in her that you can continue to improve despite no change in VO2 max. And so there are obviously I think what it moves people away from is the notion, which was probably endemic at the time I wrote that paper, that VO2 max is the be all and end all. And clearly it isn't. Over the longer term, if you keep at something, other submaximal variables continue to improve. You can operate at a higher fraction of that VO2 max more comfortably. Your running economy improves. So at any given speed, the fraction of VO2 max that you're running at is lower. You get a rightward shift of the lactate curve, all of that. So, and I think it does kind of fit with the idea that because maximal heart rate goes down year on year beyond about the age of 20, that it's going to be more difficult to improve your maximal cardiac output over time. But that doesn't mean that you can't continue to improve your overall endurance performance because of these other elements that can continue to be enhanced. But yeah, that doesn't mean that VO2 max isn't something that you shouldn't keep trying to stimulate, and it doesn't mean that it isn't trainable still. And there might well be in the future a case study which shows the exact opposite. I'd be a bit surprised, but the alternative would be that over 15 years, somebody's running economy doesn't change at all, but their VO2 max is getting progressively higher as they get older. That could happen. I mean, the point of that paper, I think, is to demonstrate that it's the interaction between those three joiner variables. This is before we discovered resilience as well, of course, but it's performance is always going to be a combination of those three numbers. So measuring one isn't going to tell you the whole story.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's underappreciated, and we've talked about it. Most podcast episodes are probably at some point talking about the relationship between VO2 max, fractional utilization, and economy as the foundations. And now not now, we've known about it for a long time, but a greater appreciation again of durability and anaerobic capacity and how they attach to that model. But how they relate and how they interconnect is definitely underappreciated.
What the paper doesn't mean is that VO2 max isn't important. I mean, the thing about Paula is that it was high from the get-go, right? So she was just able to add those other elements as she stuck at it for a long period of time. But she was blessed with having a VO2 max in the 70 to 75 region throughout. So it's not like you can get away with you can't be the best runner in the world with a VO2 max of 55. It's got to be up there anyway.
Yeah, and I think if I have an athlete come to the lab and they've got a really high VO2 max, despite not having done much training, or if it's an older athlete and they come in with a still really high VO2 max, I'll often tell them, if out of the big three, if I was going to choose one that was already going to be really good, it would be VO2 max, because it probably is the least trainable out of economy and thresholds, which I think there's case studies of veteran runners in their 50s, 60s, 70s who have got world-class economy still, although their VO2 max has gone down quite a bit. Same with high fractional utilization.
I agree. I mean, if you have, say, a 20-year-old in and they've got, a relatively low VO2 max, they've been training for a while, they're pretty fit, they've got a relatively low VO2 max and super running economy, probably they're not going to get much better. Hate to say it. Yeah. Whereas if you've got someone who's got a really high VO2 max, but at this moment in time their economy is not fantastic, and maybe they've not been training very much yet, then there's still potentially bags of room for improvement. So that's the better box of variables, I think, to have at that stage of the game.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to all of it is trainable. It's just the extent, isn't it? And especially if you've got someone who's not done that training, hasn't got a massive training history. A 70-year-old who's never done any running can get a lot fitter by starting doing training, regardless of how that is coming about, if it's VO2 max thresholds, economy, etc.
Definitely, yeah.
So it's never. I think everyone can always get better, and there's no limits, is it? What's
no, I say I've never done any coaching. I coach my wife, right? But she was never any good at sport in school, but she's sort of took up running probably about 8 years ago, and what's she now, 52, I think. So probably started when she's about 45, and she keeps getting faster every year. So, like her 5K time is something like 10 minutes faster now than it was like 7 years ago, and she's aiming to break 3:30 for a marathon next time out, sort of thing, which is not bad for someone who's like amateur. And
Definitely. Has she got a target marathon?
She's on the waiting list for Valencia. That's the obvious one. That's where she ran 3:31 or 3:32 before. She did Boston recently. But yeah, hopefully she'll get into Valencia.
Yeah, I'm sure someone will find her an entry. We're both going to be out there, I think.
Okay.
You need to get Ryan an entry, but nearly got him one. But I think the whole of the UK is heading out to Valencia.
Yeah, it's a brilliant. I've been there once, and the weather is usually spot on that time of year, and it's obviously a really, really fast course. It's a shame it's not like one of the classics. I'm sure maybe it'll be adopted in due course, but it's a way. Yeah, that's where the fast races are going to continue to be run for a while, I think.
I think so. Yeah. Well, I've been there twice and PB'd twice, and I'm going back for a third time, because why wouldn't I? I guess one question that we had for you is, we've obviously seen an explosion in times over all the distances, especially the marathon, but the 10K, the 5K world records seem to be getting set every week. With the athletes you've had coming to your lab, are you seeing differences in the physiology of these athletes, or do you think more of it is coming about through technology like shoes and faster courses, etc.? So I guess it boils down to, is it a training thing, or is it more of a technology thing that's explaining these differences, these improvements in performance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you can't deny the influence of technology. I think that has been huge. So the fact that, probably the average time in major marathons has got faster, hasn't it? Because everybody right across the field is wearing the shoe, and and whether it's just the super shoes or whether it's nutrition technology as well. I think we do know a bit more about training. I think on the shoe's an interesting one here because everybody thinks about the shoe on the day of the race. And it does have an immediate effect there. We know you just lace up, put on a different pair of shoes and your economy is instantly a few percent better. I think people forget that actually you're probably going to be your economy is going to get worse over the course of a marathon. But I'm pretty sure that it's going to get worser if you're in a regular shoe compared to in a super shoe. So not only are you more economical in the early miles by a few percent, you're probably even more, by an even greater few percent by the end. So there's that. But also, of course, all the top runners are training in these shoes as well. And they're just recovering so much faster. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility that they're actually getting to the start line in better condition as well. Because, people like Eluid and that, they do 25 miles most Thursdays, or at least every other Thursday. And they're human as well. And they do feel a bit beaten up on a Friday, at least used to. And they not so much anymore. They feel, because it's that the cushioning, isn't it? It's so good. You have much less damage. And so I think a lot of athletes are either doing more training than they've ever done, or they're able to do the same amount of training a bit faster. So I think there's a training stimulus. I think we still keep uncovering incredible talents, though, irrespective of the technology. So obviously we've got Ines Fitzgerald locally, and she's brilliant. So I've been fortunate to have done some work with her, and when I compare her with Paula at the same age, arguably Ines is a bit better on the treadmill, and she's showing that on times that she's running on the track and road as well. So she's awesome. Phoebe Gill is another fantastic talent who's coming through, obviously at shorter distances at the moment. So, yeah, there are some huge talents, and you can't say that their performance is just because of they're wearing better shoes than some of the people in the past. So that would be unfair to them, because I think there's some super young runners out there at the moment as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm good friends with Jake Smith, and he's been sharing with some of the training that Ines has done, and it sounds very impressive.
Yeah.
I guess one thing on more on Ines, is she going to be a marathon runner like Paula eventually?
I think she could. I think the world's her also. I hopefully not too soon. It's the same with Paula. There's no point going to that too soon. Have a long career, get as fast as you can over 1,500 meters and 3K, 5K. Just enjoy winning those races and running as quickly as you can. And obviously she's brilliantly coached by Gav and having Joe Pavey. What better mentor could you have for someone who's had a really long and successful career as a female distance runner than Joe Pavey? So she's really well advised, and and it might be that she takes to the road at some later stage, but there's certainly no pressure for her to do so. I think she could do well over longer distances as well, but yeah, it's hard to tell. It depends how things like running economy and whatever obviously improve over time.
I think given your Twitter handle of Andy Beetroot, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask about Beetroot. And I think maybe the avenue we wanted to ask about was like your view on taking it for well trained and up to elite performers versus people starting out. And if I can give a brief anecdote, like I used to work in a running store, and the week before Cardiff Half Marathon, we would have so many people coming in that had read Runner's World, and it was their first half marathon, and they probably hadn't trained much, if at all, and they would buy loads of beetroot shots. And as far as I understand, the advice is maybe different between those groups. But yeah, I wonder if Is it worth taking, I guess, is my sort of underlying question. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the meta-analyses suggest that it is, that on balance there is an ergogenic effect. Obviously, you've got to get the right dose. Most of the negative studies have just not given people sufficient nitrate in the first place, which is stupid because we did a dose response study a long time ago. Can't even remember when it was, 2011 maybe, which shows that if you take less than 6 millimoles of nitrate, you're not going to see any effect. And there's lots of studies that are still being published where they're given, three or four. You're not going to get any effect there. I think there is some quite convincing evidence that the better you are as an aerobic athlete, the smaller the effect, which is kind of stands to reason. I mean, every you're going to get a smaller effect with anything when they're kind of already that well conditioned. But you start to get into the margin where it's hard to tell whether there's an effect on it. There could be a small effect, but it's going to be kind of lost in the noise a little bit. So then you start to get, well, what is your perception of this? It's the same with the elite athletes. If you put them in different shoes and try and measure the difference in running economy, the difference is so small. It might be that one shoe is slightly superior to another, but your error margin around your assessment of oxygen costs is too great to be absolutely confident in that. So you've got to take the athlete's own perception. Which of the shoes do they feel best in? And I think it's the same with nitrate to some extent. When you're at that level, is this something that you feel you do feel more comfortable with it? You do believe that it improves your performance. So there's that bit of an effect. And there are, like with a lot of nutritional ergogenic aids, responders and non-responders. I don't think it's actually I don't believe it'll make you worse ever. It might be a waste of money and it might not make you any better, but there's probably a chance that it could make you slightly faster. So you need to kind of work out whether you're a responder or not. So I think it's definitely worth trying. That's all I'll say. And I've got no vested interest in it. I'm just interested in the phenomenon. I'm not associated with Beat It or anything, so I don't get a penny if you buy however much the shots are these days.
Not on commission then.
No.
So I think just before we wrap it up and let you enjoy the rest of your evening, Andy, I'd be really interested to get your take on, do you think we've reached the pinnacle of running performance? Like, are we nearly there? Like, or do you think there's still a way to go? And if you do think there's still some improvements to be made, where do you think they're going to come from? Like, you talked briefly about like shoe technology and allowing people to train more. Is that an avenue?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I don't know where the scientific breakthroughs are going to come. I think we always keep saying, I think if you go back to 1954 and before Roger Bannister, around that time, nobody thought that, breaking the 4-minute mile was possible. Everybody thought they were approaching the limit then, didn't they? And clearly we weren't. And the same with the 2-hour marathon thing. There were lots of people who thought that was impossible. Obviously, it's been done, albeit in a controlled race. But I think it probably would have been done by now had that tragic event not happened in Kenya. And there's new talents coming through all the time, and I think we'll see a sub-2 marathon in the next few years probably. So I think there's still room for improvement. I think, though, it depends on. There's that base of the pyramid thing, which I'm sure you've heard before, but if you imagine a triangle, the peak of that triangle is only going to be as high as the base of people coming into it. So I'm a bit worried in places like the UK and the States and the Western world, where people are becoming less active generally. Kids are perhaps not doing as much sport at school. Maybe there's less channeling of talent into athletics. That would be unfortunate. It does mean that when you find a talent, you've got to really do your best to nurture it and keep it in the system. But I do also think that in parts of Africa and other parts of the world, probably, as people find that they can make money out of this, or that they're really good at it, at something. And unfortunately, obviously, there are going to be Western influences on this. But people are still running a lot. And there are probably more females running in East Africa than ever before. And that's why you're seeing, what we're seeing in that regard. And if that continues, then I think there could be still quite a few shocks and surprises on the horizon.
No, I definitely think there's more, room for improvement on the female side.
Yeah.
Just from cultural shifts, and just women participating in running.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, if you can grow that bottom of that pyramid out, you're going to find
Yeah.
some more. The next Kelvin Kiptum who's going to just
Exactly.
come and run something insane.
Yeah, and and I think the hope is that Faith Kipyegon is gonna be the catalyst for women's sport that Eluid was for the men's. Be that kind of figurehead. I hope that happens. But that's the idea, that she's somebody that people can relate to. I think she's not quite as well known as Eluid at the moment, and she's a slightly different personality, but no less intriguing and engaging. And so hopefully she'll be able to do well on the 26th of June and inspire, in the same way Eluid did. He's not necessarily saying you can all break 2 hours for the marathon, but you've all got your own targets and you can probably get closer to them or surpass them way more than you can possibly imagine. So just kind of believe and give it a try. And the idea is, I think, that the same thing will happen with Faith as the kind of spearhead for that one on the women's side.
Great. No, I'm definitely looking forward to watching it. And Faith is very likable. No one's ever got a bad word to say about Faith. So I know that regardless of their competitors or not, everyone will be cheering her on. So it'd be fantastic to go and see that. We really appreciate your time this evening. Is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
I don't think so. No, that's good. Enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Thank you very much again.
Pleasure.